This is a video about the multiverse and its implications for art appreciation. Now, I know that sounds a little bit weird, but I think that understanding the world has implications for the things within the world. And of course, art is a part of this physical reality that we live in. So, understanding physics might have something to do with understanding art. Maybe even understanding art will have some implications for physics. I don't know. So I want to make a simple case for parallel universes. I'm going to be focusing on the nature of light. I really just want to convince you that light travels in curves. It's the most basic thing. And then light has undivisible, quantized singular units. Those are kind of the two main things we'll be focusing on. And then we'll look at some shadow patterns that occur with light. All that's going to suggest that the world is much bigger than we think. Okay, if you're in for this, my name is Zachary. Let's strap in. I'm getting most of this from the book called The Fabric of Reality. Chapter 2 is called Shadows. It's all about the multiverse. That's where I'm getting most of my information from here. I'm trying to simplify it a little bit, and then I'm going to obviously give some implications for art. I am reading a script. I'm quite shaky on the material. Like I'm unsure about this video. Okay, if it's uploaded, that means it's going to be good. If it's not uploaded, that means I was I was too afraid. Okay, but I'm just nervous about it. Yeah, I feel like I don't have a good way of having the logic flow very well, and the logic needs to flow very well for this one because I mean, oh my gosh, it's a tough one to swallow if you're not prepared to swallow it. All right, we're gonna get into it. Okay. Okay, so the first thing that we want to look at is that light travels in curves rather than straight lines. So let's imagine a flashlight. You got a flashlight, you have it on a screen. All you would see is, of course, a bright circle, and then you'd see like a little bit of a blurry section, and then you'd see a dark section. Imagine you're in a dark room, obviously, a dark room, screen, you have a flashlight, and that's all you have. Okay. Bright section, blurry section, darkness. Our interest, we're going to focus in on this blurry section. What is happening at this blurry section? And is there a way to make the blurry section smaller, maybe even disappear, such that you have only a bright section and a sharp cutoff to a dark section? Is that possible? Okay, we can imagine a very simple, easy way to attempt to make a sharp change from the bright section to the dark section. You can just do this by having a barrier. So like imagine you have something like this that has like a slit, right? And you could imagine, obviously you wouldn't be using a hand, but you get what I'm saying here. You have like a barrier, and if you just shine a light through that barrier, it would show the shadow of this barrier, right? It would be like a silhouette. And the silhouette would just be the bright spot in the middle, and then the barrier that you see around it. Does that make sense? You just have that. Unfortunately, if you are to actually try to do this, you would see very easily that you don't get this bright spot and a very sharp cutoff. You still see a blurry section. And the reason for that is that light curves. Light does not travel straight in a straight line. It will spread out, so to speak. I mean, actually spreading out. I don't know why I said so to speak. It's actually spreading out. It's going through the barrier and then spreading. So it would go through the barrier and then spread out, which means that you get this section of like frayed light at the edges, which causes that blurry section. If light is being shown and it is blocked by something and then a shadow is cast, that shadow is never a clear shadow. It always has a blurry section. So that blurry section that you always see with a shadow, that is a demonstration of light spreading, traveling in curves, not traveling in straight lines. Okay. So another question comes, if you have light that spreads out, how much can it spread? It's a simple question. How much can it spread out? So imagine you have a light source. You have your flashlight and you have it flashing on a screen. Obviously, you get a circle and then you get the spread out part and then you get the darkness. Okay. If you move further away from the actual screen, your light source moves away from the screen, the 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 light seems to get bigger, like the circle will get bigger. The the uh, the section that's blurry will also get much bigger, and then of course the darkness is just going to be darkness. Okay. And that is also an indication of the light spreading out more. So the further away that you get, the more spread out the light gets. And you have essentially two options with this. Either the light will spread out infinitely, or the light will spread out to a point, and then it will no longer be able to be spread evenly. So I want to give another kind of a simple illustration. Still think of a flashlight, but instead of the flashlight going to a screen, the flashlight is just shining onto a person, like a person, like you can see essentially you're looking at a flashlight. A person looks at a flashlight. Okay, and that flashlight goes far away, farther and farther away. What happens from the perspective of the person looking at the flashlight is that the flashlight becomes dimmer, right? Of course, first of all, it looks smaller, then it becomes dimmer, and presumably it gets dimmer and dimmer and more dim and more dim, and it just continues to forever get dimmer. And if light were to be able to infinitely spread, it would just continue to always get increasingly dimmer and never actually changing its behavior in any way. But what we actually do see is that the light gets dimmer and dimmer until you get to a point where the light no longer gets dimmer. There's no less dimness in the light. But what happens is the light begins to flicker. A light source from far away will flicker. At first, the flickering will be quite fast, so you might even not register it as flickering. Eventually, it'll become much more noticeable flickering. So flick, 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 and then as the flashlight goes further away from the eye, the flickering will go slower. Flick, flick, flick. Flickering. I'm saying flick as if that's not the word. I would think blip is the word. I don't know. It flickers slower. And you have this increasing time between the single blips. However, each individual blip of the flickering, each individual blip is of the same brightness. So, what is happening here? What happens is that the light is spreading out. And as the light spreads out, when multiple when there's a lot of light coming at once, the light is brighter. And then when you get to a point where there's a small amount of light, it is dim. And you get to a point where it is the smallest amount of light that you can have, and you then have the smallest amount of dimness that you can have. You have the lowest dimness. And but the light is still spreading out. And what does it mean to spread out? It means that you have packets of light called photons. These are individual packets of light. And instead of having it spread thinly, you just have a packet and then space around it, like nothing around it, and then more photons, and then nothing around it, and then more photons. You get what I mean? So instead of an even spread of light, evenly distributed, you get small packets of light broken up by darkness. Imagine the difference between spreading peanut butter very smoothly and then doing something slightly different where you can't spread it smoothly, so you just have a chunk here, and then like an inch later you put another chunk, and then an inch later you put a different chunk, and then you have it spread out into this like mesh. That's what's happening. So when you have a flashlight and a person is looking at it, so a light source into a person's eyes, as the light source goes further away, the number of photons that reach the eye decreases until you get to a point where the number cannot decrease any lower. So you only have one photon at a time, but then you just have time in between the photons. You have a blip, and then some number of seconds, and then another blip, and then some number of seconds, and another blip within these spots. And this happens for two reasons. Because light does not travel in straight lines, first reason. And the second reason is because light is quantized into these discrete packets that cannot get any smaller. You can't get smaller than those smallest packets. Okay, so light travels in curves and light is quantized, and there is this sort of necessary blurriness that happens with shadows. But what happens if, for example, we have this slit and we just make it so small, we make it so tiny that only a very narrow stream of light can go through? Would that make the the change between the bright spot and the dark spot, would it make it sharp? Would it actually solve this issue of wanting to have an actual clear dark spot? Well, no. What happens is, even when you get super small, if you get the slit to be extremely small, you still have this sort of blurry section, but you even get weirder things that happen. You start to get this kind of weird pattern. It's weird sort of flowing, strange pattern. I've called it fraying earlier, and this is like another, I mean, this is a great word for it, especially if you have like a regular light and you shine it through like a really small barrier. What will happen is that you'll start to see different colors come out of it. Like it would no longer look like a white light. It would look like you would start to see like a red light and then a blue light, and then it would be kind of weird. It would just look strange. And what's going on there is this fray. I called it fraying. It's a fray. The light is like coming apart at the seams in a sense. And you can get even weirder things that happen if you have one slit that's really small and you have it right next to another slit that's also really small. Both of those slits next together, again, what you would want to see, what you would expect to see, is a silhouette. It's just like this two bright spots next to each other, surrounded by what would look like the barrier, a shadow of the barrier. But what you actually see is this strange pattern, which I will show on screen.
This is just a quick demonstration video to try and show you the interference pattern from n equals 2 slits, n equals 3 slits, up to n equals 5 slits. All right, so standard double slit pattern. We see the fringes are spaced equally.
And if you were to include even more slits, so let's say you have 4 slits, you would see a different strange pattern.
That's 4 slits. Now you see that there are 3 dark fringes between adjacent global maxima. We've got a bright spot, 2 dimmer spots, and then another really bright spot.
And in fact, if you have 3 slits, if you have 5 slits, they all give you unique, very different patterns. But we want to look at the 2 slit pattern and the 4 slit pattern and see what happens with those. The weird thing is that these patterns don't sort of stack in any kind of obvious way. Like obviously, if you have, as I mentioned, of course, when you have a single slit, it gets a weird pattern. If you have 2 slits, it doesn't seem like it's 2 single slit patterns put next to each other. It's just a different pattern. And then when you have 4 slits, you get this even weirder, different pattern, which doesn't look like two slit patterns next to each other. And in fact, when you have the 4 slit pattern, there is a part of the screen that was bright during the 2 slit pattern, but is no longer bright during the 4 slit pattern. What does that even mean? It means that there's a specific interference happening. Interference, I'm just going to call it interference. Because something is getting in the way of the light. When there are 2 slits open, the light will go in this direction and it will hit this spot and brighten this spot. But when 2 other slits are nearby, the light that would have traveled to that spot is being interfered by something else. It's being intercepted by something. Now, what could that thing be? What could it be that is interfering with the light? So we're gonna hammer into this for one moment, okay? We have 4 open slits. You get a specific pattern. If you cover 2 of the slits, you get a spot that becomes more bright. Okay. Now, let's say we cover it with fog. What would happen? Well, if you cover 2 of the slits with fog, you go back to the 2-slit pattern. Okay. So fog interrupts the interference. Does that make sense? Let's say we cover 2 of the 4 slits with diamond. What happens? Nothing. We still get the 4-slit pattern. The interference stays. Okay, so now we have something that is blocked by fog, but is not blocked by diamond, which is a bit of a weird type of thing. There are not many things that are interrupted by fog and not interrupted by diamonds. If you put glass in front of 2 of the slits, there is no interruption. If you put a mirror in front of the 2 of the slits, there is an interruption. So what does this mean? That means that there is something that is interfering the lights. So the cause of the interference is it's found in the light beam. It is reflected by things that reflect light, like fog or like a mirror. And it seems to go through things that light would also go through, like glass or like diamond. Those things, light can go through those things. And the thing that interferes the light also can go through those things. So all of that to say that it seems like the thing that is interfering with the light is behaving like light. It quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it looks like a duck. Okay, it's light. Light is the thing that is interfering with the light. Now that might seem obvious, okay, and it might seem a little bit dumb that I'm even hammering down so much on this, that it's light that's causing the interference. But keep that sense of how obvious it seems that, of course, it's light interfering with other light, and the light going through one slit is interfering with the light going through the other. Of course, it makes a lot of sense. It's obvious. Let's keep that feeling of obviousness and wonder what would happen if, instead of just using a beam of light going through these slit patterns, what would happen if we used single photons at a time? So remember, if you have a light source and it's really far away, it spreads out until you get to a point where it starts to flicker. You get a blip and then a pause and then a blip and then a pause and then a blip and then a pause and so on. So what would happen if we had this barrier of various slits and then we had a single photon go through it, we wait it, we have another single photon go through, we wait, and we have another single photon go through and we wait? What would be the resulting pattern? Now, it might make sense that since you only have a single photon at a time, you should, in the end of this, have a perfectly perfect silhouette. Perfectly perfect. That's a weird way of putting it, right? A silhouette that doesn't have frayed edges. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have this interference pattern. You should have a bright spot where there are slits, and then you should have a dark spot where there are barriers, and it might just look like a silhouette of the barriers. That's what you would expect. That's what I would expect. But what really happens is the exact same thing. If you have a barrier that has 2 slits and you shine single photons at a time, waiting in between each photon shot, you will come to an image that is the same as the 2-slit pattern that you get with a continuous beam of light. And then if you were to have 4 slits open and shine single photons at a time with pauses in between each shot photon, you will have a different pattern that indicates that there was interference in this experiment. And what is the thing that causes the interference? As we mentioned before, it is light. So if we are only providing a single photon at a time, and we are still getting interference, by light, where is that light coming from that is interfering with the photon that we are shooting? Do you see the curiosity here with this? And hopefully I've laid this out clearly enough, because again, I feel a little bit unsure about how to describe this, but hopefully I laid this out clearly enough and it makes enough sense. Because it means that our only possible solution here is that when we shine a single photon, there are other photons that are interfering with our singular photon. So I'm going to call the photon that we think of in our universe, that is going to be a tangible photon. And there are other intangible photons that are interfering with our tangible photon. That's the simplest way to put it. And quantum mechanics clearly predicts that every photon will have many intangible counterparts, and they travel in all different possible paths. Because remember that you have a light, and the light will spread out, which would mean that your single light would it has the possibility to travel straight. It has the possibility to travel kind of a curving right, has a possibility to kind of really curve left. It goes in all these possible different directions. And if you were to look at the equations in quantum mechanics, it would describe all of those things happening, even if you only have a single photon to go through your single barrier. And only in these very specialized tests, you have these photons that interfere with each other. Usually they don't, but in this case, you have this sort of interference. And interestingly enough, quantum mechanics also predicts that this happens with all other particles. It's not just photons that have this behavior. There are many other things. There are more complicated experiments that are required to go through this, and I don't know how to describe all those things, but you can see it with silver atoms. You can have these experiments done and show that silver atoms will have this type of behavior and interfere with themselves. And other molecules, larger molecules, also have the same behavior where they will interfere. So this effect is not limited to light. And what this means is that for every particle in our entire universe, there is a tangible one which is in our universe, and there are multiple intangible ones. And if you group various intangible particles together, it might make a lot of sense to just call them a universe, a parallel universe. And so altogether, you have various parallel universes and our universe, and we would consider that whole thing altogether to be a multiverse. Now, as with anything in physics, it's not as simple as a clean division of multiple parallel universes. They do interact in more interesting and unique ways that I don't really know how to get into and describe very cleanly, but close enough to just say that there are parallel universes. And sometimes it makes more sense to just call the whole thing a multiverse and just think about how all of them interact in weird ways. So in the multiverse, we have this thing that happens where, let's say, in this case of the experiment that we just described, you have a single particle of light, and that photon, single particle of light, is interacting with a barrier and then shining onto a screen. So I'm going to call the barrier and the screen, that's going to be the environment, and the singular photon is going to be the physical system that we care about. And that physical system will always go into every possible configuration. That physical system will always go into every possible configuration that it could while in the multiverse. That physical system will go through different variations when interacting with this environment. I hope I'm saying that clearly. Your physical system will be varied and the environment will stay the same. But the opposite also occurs, where the physical system stays the same and there are many different variant environments. both of those situations occur. And as I said, it is not only with light, so it's literally every physical system. You can think of any physical system in this way, where the physical system will be varied in the parallel universes while the environment stays the same, or the opposite happens where the physical system is the same and the environment is varied. So this is the exact same thing as light spreading out and becoming blurry. Everything in the multiverse does this. It's kind of a metaphorical spreading out. All particles are going to be moving in all possible directions. So occasionally, only in these highly specialized experiments, the variants can interact and interfere, but usually they don't really interact with each other. But they can, at some point, converge and stabilize. So this is the process of what we call error correction. Maybe we don't call it that. Maybe I'm just calling it that. Okay, this is a process called error correction, where things gonna drift, things spread out and change. Metaphorically, they kind of spread out. The particles are the things that are spreading out and going in different directions. And physical systems will become slight variations of themselves. Okay. And some of those physical systems are going to be set up in such a way that they return to a specific configuration. They return to a particular way. They will drift and then they'll come back into where they want it, the original state. And then they'll drift and they'll come back to the original state. That's the error correction process. And I think this is one of the main insights about the multiverse that's kind of relevant for me and maybe just for regular people. I think this is like really the main insight about the multiverse. Okay, things drift and then they require error correction to return. And this gives us a few interesting metrics that they're still not really directly accessible because you can't really access the rest of the multiverse, but you have you can mathematically show some of these things, or you could just imagine the possibility of these types of things. Okay, let me go into you have two different metrics here. Let's say given any physical system, you can imagine any possible change of that physical system, and the question is what percentage of these possible changes would cause no change in the function of that physical system. So I'm like still at this part, like I'm still feeling like I'm not describing this well, and I'm feeling shaky about it. But I think it's a good idea still to finish recording this and release it. This is my understanding as of today, where I am today. Okay. Anyway, the physical system can change, and every physical system is going to change and drift. And in many of the cases, there are going to be changes that don't actually affect anything. There's no difference in function. And you could literally just have a metric of, given all of the possible changes, this amount of changes make a difference and this amount of changes don't make a difference. And you can have a ratio, literally half of the changes make a difference, half don't make a difference. And there you go. You have a metric that you can describe of what percentage of these things cause no changes. Okay, and then the next metric is going to be something similar, but given every possible change of a physical system, which percentage of those changes would be detected and error corrected, right? So you might have a physical system where the changes do make a difference, but nothing is there to notice it, and nothing can make it go back to what you want it to be like. So you're just screwed. But you might have a particular physical system where some changes become noticed and detected by something, and given that detection, it is error corrected so that it no longer so that it continues to have its function. Okay, I think that's good enough. I think that makes sense. Okay, so that brings us to art, and this is what obviously I care about. This whole channel is about art appreciation and different ways of appreciating art, and this gives us a new way, a new, very weird and interesting way to appreciate art and think about art, the nature of art, really the nature of beauty, generally speaking. So this should happen with all physical systems, the things spread out, things become varied, things become differentiated, different. And sometimes those differences don't make a difference, they don't matter. And other times those differences are noticed, detected, and error corrected so that they converge and no longer are differentiated. So imagine that somebody is making a work of art, they're painting something. There are going to be some parts of a work of art, if you're painting, there are going to be some parts where it doesn't matter what color you're using. We're going to be talking about colors for a second. There's going to be some parts where it doesn't matter what colors you're using. So in different parts of the multiverse, different parallel universes, you will be painting and you will be deciding, I want to use this color paint for this particular part of the work of art. And sometimes that won't matter. And if it doesn't matter, then in various different parallel universes, you're going to have different colors. There'll be no reason for you to have chosen the same color. And in other situations, you will be painting certain things for a certain reason. Like you might be painting grass. And so you might decide, I want to paint the grass purple. And then you'll think to yourself, oh, but really, I'm actually painting a realistic painting. And so grass isn't normally purple. So I won't decide to paint it purple. You error correct and you converge onto a different color. And whatever that color might be, you might converge on green, you might converge on yellow, and then you could have a this metric that I mentioned before. Like in the multiverse, 60% of the parallel universes of you painting this thing decide to paint it green, and 40% decide to paint it yellow. And then you have some unfathomably small percentages that decide to paint it different colors. That is very interesting from an art appreciation perspective because that means that there's a particular reason for choosing certain colors. Now, obviously, it's an obvious reason in this case because I just said you're just coloring it green or yellow because it's grass, and you're trying to make a realistic painting of grass. That's super obvious. But imagine other aspects of a work of art. Maybe you want to draw a person, and they are in a particular pose like this. And they could have their pose like this. The pose could be like this. The pose could be like this. You see, I'm moving my arm if you're only listening to this. I'm making a pose with my arm out, one of my arms stretched out, and my arm could be higher or lower. There could be a particular angle for my arm. And in different parts of the multiverse, I might decide to make it higher or lower. And there might be certain things that uh, cause me to put the arm in a certain position. Maybe 80% of them have my arm in this position, while 10% have my arm in this position. What does that mean? And then, there are, 10 more percent doing other things. What does that indicate? That's definitely indicating something interesting in terms of art appreciation, but what is it? So I would want to say that something that is beautiful, a decision that is made in a work of art that leads to a beautiful work of art or beautiful aspect of a work of art, the beautiful thing will be more consistent across the multiverse, and something that is not beautiful will be more differentiated across the multiverse. And that is the unique thing about art appreciation that I want to talk about in terms of the multiverse. Because every possibility can happen, every deviation and change and variation will happen, but many of them will be error corrected, and you would error correct towards the most beautiful, because you would notice that if something were changed and it were not beautiful, you would detect that and you would error correct it towards something that is beautiful. And that would converge to something beautiful. So as you're making works of art across the multiverse in parallel universes, the beautiful part will converge. The beauty will be the same. Okay, that's my case for the multiverse, and that's my case for some form of unique new way of appreciating art given this perspective of the multiverse. Again, I'm not really sure if I described it very well. That's just my attempt today. As I said, this is a derivative of the work of David Deutsch. I was introduced to David Deutsch about a year ago. I read his books, both of his books, a couple of months after being introduced to him. So I guess I've known about this for, 9 months, about something like that. I don't know when I started to apply it to art specifically, but I've known about this for some time. And this is just my shaky attempt to try to describe this thing that I think about and how I know it now. And hopefully in a few more months, I'll be able to describe it much more clearly, much more concisely, much more cleanly and directly. But this is what we have today. So tell me what you think about this. If you got this far into the video, you must be into it. You might be into art appreciation. You might be into physics. You might be into just epistemology broadly, or David Deutsch's philosophy broadly. I mean, what do you think? Does this case make sense? What's your general feeling of this idea that a work of art will be differentiated in different parts of the multiverse and some parts of it will converge because of error correction? Does that seem like a useful or interesting metric at all, or fact of the world at all to you? What do you think?